Hey, it's Thursday, so that means a new Maritime video blog. This week, we are going to talk specifically about the U.S. Coast Guard, and I rant and rave a little bit about the lack of funding for that great organization. Happy Thursday, and thank you for joining us for another Maritime video blog here at International Maritime Security Associates. If you're new to our video blog channel, I'd like to welcome you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you get notified every time we put out a new video, and also make sure you hit the like button if you like the videos. Check out some of our previous episodes in the folder. We also have what we call a life and events channel where we post things up there that we're involved in life, just so you kind of get to know us on a business side and on a personal side. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the U.S. Coast Guard. We typically try to address issues with more of an international flavor, but we wanted to take a look at the authority and the jurisdiction of the U.S. Coast Guard because it's pretty broad-reaching as far as a law enforcement agency goes here in the United States, and there are some international ramifications. So to give you a little bit of history, I spent 8 years with the Coast Guard, so I'm very familiar about the Coast Guard operations and what they do and the authority and jurisdiction of the Coast Guard. So I give an interesting perspective and sometimes get a little opinionated because I really appreciate the job that the men and women of the Coast Guard do each and every day, who are out there protecting lives, doing law enforcement operations, the construction tenders, the buoy tenders, support personnel, aviation side. There's a lot that goes into that organization, which is just about the same size as the New York City Police Department. So, authority and jurisdiction of the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard gets its authority and was established through Title 14 of the United States Codes. And we'll have links to all this stuff down below so you don't have to memorize it. 14 U.S.C. 1 established the Coast Guard in the United States. 14 U.S.C. 2 defined the Coast Guard's authority kind of in a broad sense. But the main law that really defines Coast Guard operations is 14 U.S.C. 89. That sets forward what the Coast Guard is allowed to do. And through that law, and also other laws and regulations, the Coast Guard has fairly broad-reaching authority. The Coast Guard has authority on all U.S. flagged vessels in waters in which they have jurisdiction, but a little caveat to that is the Coast Guard also has authority to conduct law enforcement operations in international waters on vessels that have flags with countries that the United States has an MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding. So there's a number of MOUs, or these Memorandums of Understanding, that the United States has with other countries to do joint law enforcement operations. And the Coast Guard really is one of the biggest benefactors of that. So if you're on a foreign flagged vessel in international waters and the Coast Guard says that they're coming on board, you may ask, hey, how do they have the authority to do that? That's through one of these Memorandums of Understanding that gives the Coast Guard, through their international agreements, the authority to do that. One of the unique cases in international operations would be vessels that would be or flagless, no flag whatsoever. If the Coast Guard law enforcement team on scene determines that the vessel has no flag state, then the Coast Guard can go on and enforce laws and regulations of the United States. And that would be true with any international law enforcement organization that came on a stateless vessel, a vessel without any flag. They would be able to assert their laws and authorities over that vessel. So the Coast Guard, from an international standpoint, from a law enforcement perspective, has a fairly far reach. The Coast Guard also has some unique capabilities that really puts the Coast Guard in a position to work with local, state, federal, and tribal law enforcement agencies here in the United States. There's a law, again in Title 14, it's 14 U.S.C. 141, that gives the Coast Guard the authority to work with law enforcement agencies of other jurisdictions, and maybe agencies of non-maritime jurisdictions where the Coast Guard has expertise to be able to do that. They can also work with foreign law enforcement agencies and organizations, again, through approval process, to be able to work with those organizations where the Coast Guard has expertise to assist those organizations. The Coast Guard does a phenomenal job working with federal, state, local, tribal law enforcement partners, military organizations, and law enforcement organizations around the world. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of foreign law enforcement organizations when I was part of the tactical law enforcement teams, and also worked with some state and local law enforcement organizations here in the United States, and really had a lot of phenomenal opportunities. One of the things that I wanted to talk about today, also and give props to, was a news story that came out earlier about the Coast Guard cutter Mohawk, 270-foot cutter. The crew has been involved in counter-narcotics operations and had fairly sizable seizure during their law enforcement operations, 190 tons, which is estimated at about $5.6 billion. They worked on the East and West Coast and Caribbean, Pacific, and Atlantic operations. Just like to give a props and a shout out to the men and women of the Coast Guard cutter Mohawk. Great job on your interdiction operations, and it also involved of other agencies and organizations. One of the things, and now this comes to opinion time because I can't do a video about the Coast Guard where I don't insert my opinion. Part of that article, the Commandant of the Coast Guard talked about really kind of a lack of funding for Coast Guard operations. Unfortunately, with the size of that organization, funding difficulties have always been a way of life with the Coast Guard, and to me, it's crazy to think that our government can't put together a budget for one of the most active organizations in the Department of Homeland Security. And not to take away from our brothers and sisters in the other organizations, but I'm always surprised. Coast Guard cutter Mohawk is a cutter that was built most probably before I was born. Most of the Coast Guard assets are extremely old. They've gone through upgrades and updates, but it's time to really look at a long-term strategic plan of how to push this agency forward. The Homeland Response and Security cutters, that's great, but there's a whole fleet of vessels and aircraft that are aging that really need to be replaced. The men and women of the Coast Guard, and this article brought this point out, which I thought was awesome. The men and women of the Coast Guard spend half of their time just trying to keep their assets operational so they can go out and do law enforcement operations. It's no way to run an organization. So again, in my opinion, Congress, executive branch, wake up and give this organization funding to execute on what they do. These guys are on the front lines doing drug interdiction, migrant smuggling, human trafficking, homeland security operations here in the United States. They're keeping the waterways open to keep vessels and traffic moving. There's construction tenders that are doing projects in the inland waterways and the river systems here in the United States. Buoy tenders that do a phenomenal job. The aircraft, the cutters, the tactical law enforcement teams, the MSSR teams, and the support personnel, they need the funding to be able to do this. So join me in this fight to help to continue to keep the Coast Guard on a funding level that will help them to move their mission forward. I just appreciate the job that every one of the men and women of the U.S. Coast Guard do. I was fortunate to be a part of that family for 8 years and served with some awesome people. So there's my little rambling about the Coast Guard. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Each week we put out a new video here on our Maritime video blog channel about a maritime related topic. Make sure you hit the like button if you like the video. Subscribe to the channel to get updated on videos when we post new ones. Drop comments in the comments section below. Look for useful links down there as well. Connect to us through our social media, which is detailed down below. And if you have any questions or there's anything we can do to help you maintain regulatory compliance or improve your maritime risk management, reach out to us. Our phone number is +1 234 312 4855 or connect to us at imsa.global. Thanks for joining us this week.